the most dangerous and ignored country in the war. Right now, there is a country that almost nobody in Western media is discussing seriously. And I find this deeply strange, because if you look at this war carefully, if you strip away the noise and really look at what is happening structurally, this mystery nation is standing dead center in the middle of everything. It brokered the recent ceasefire. It hosted the most critical peace talks of our lifetime. It holds deep, highly active military ties with both Washington and Tehran. And crucially, it is a heavily armed nuclear power.
Serious, before we dive in, I want to be incredibly clear about something. When I say this is the most dangerous country in this war, I do not mean this country is trying to cause danger. I mean this country has found itself in the most dangerous position on the global chessboard. There is a massive difference. We are talking about a nuclear-armed nation that is currently being squeezed in a vice from both sides simultaneously by the geopolitical weight of the United States on one side and by the devastating economic and territorial consequences of this war on the other. When you squeeze a nuclear power from both sides, the risks become incredibly difficult to calculate. Today, I want to use our standard framework: game theory, structural history, and the 4 dimensions of war to explain exactly what this nation's position means for the conflict, the region, and the world. Let me start by telling you a story, because this analogy captures the situation perfectly. Imagine a man who lives between 2 very powerful, very angry neighbors. Both of these neighbors are locked in a vicious, escalating blood feud. Suddenly, both neighbors march up to this man's door and say, "We need your help to mediate." Now, this man is not weak. He has a gun. Actually, he has a vault full of high-yield explosives. But his house is incredibly fragile. His family's income depends almost entirely on remittances from relatives working in the exact neighborhoods where the fighting is happening. His fuel has to be delivered through the active war zone. His food prices are skyrocketing every single day because of the chaos outside. And now, both of his heavily armed neighbors are knocking on his door, demanding his intervention. What does this man do? And what happens to everyone else on the street if he makes the wrong choice? Let's look at the facts of what just happened, because in my analysis, we always start with cold, hard facts before interpretation. On the 8th of April, 2026, just a few weeks ago, this mystery country stepped out of the shadows and brokered a ceasefire between the United States and Iran. Think about the sheer scale of what this means. A nuclear war was potentially building up. Donald Trump had just posted on Truth Social, and I want you to remember how serious this moment was. He posted, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again." The Secretary General of Amnesty International stated this constituted a threat of genocide. Multiple U.S. Democrats were calling to invoke the 25th Amendment. The world genuinely held its breath, believing nuclear weapons were actively on the table. And in the middle of that apocalyptic buildup, this unmentioned nation stepped in. Their prime minister and their army chief, the most powerful man in their country, personally negotiated a ceasefire framework based on a 10-point Iranian proposal. And miraculously, it worked, at least temporarily. Days later, on April 11th, J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, boarded a plane with a 300-member American delegation. They flew across the world and sat face-to-face with Iranian representatives for 21 grueling hours. This was the highest-level direct meeting between America and Iran since the 1979 revolution. But where did it happen? It wasn't in Geneva. It wasn't in Vienna. It wasn't in Qatar. It happened in a country that does not even formally recognize the State of Israel, a country that built its nuclear arsenal in secret, a country that has now become the host, the mediator, and the guarantor of the most important diplomatic process of the 21st century. So who is this indispensable nation? Let's use game theory to figure it out. In any high-stakes negotiation, you need a mediator that both sides fundamentally trust. The glaring problem with the US-Iran war is that there is almost nobody on earth that both sides trust at the same time. Let's look at the obvious candidates. Qatar has been used before, but Qatar hosts massive American military bases, and Iran has highly complicated feelings about Qatar's alignment. Plus, Qatar was already struck by Iranian-aligned forces earlier in this war. It is not neutral ground. Turkey? Interesting option. Turkey is a NATO member, giving it credibility with Washington, and it maintains economic ties with Tehran. But U.S.-Turkish relations are deeply strained, and Turkey has its own vested interests in the region's power vacuum. China? China is Iran's biggest oil customer and has invested over $100 billion into Iranian infrastructure. They want the Strait of Hormuz open, but America does not trust Beijing. In fact, Washington just accused China of arming Iran. Russia. The problem there is obvious. America and Russia are actively adversarial. So who is left? Who possesses deep, decades-long military ties with Iran's Revolutionary Guards? Because you have to negotiate with the IRGC, not just the politicians, and simultaneously has a relationship warm enough with Donald Trump that Trump openly praises their top military commander. I am talking about Pakistan, specifically Pakistan's Field Marshal Asim Munir. This man holds deep personal relationships with Iran's military leadership because Pakistan and Iran share a massive volatile border. At the same time, he has built a powerful personal rapport with Donald Trump. In Trump's worldview, personal relationships dictate foreign policy. Pakistan is not the mediator because it is the obvious choice. Pakistan is mediating because it is the only choice. And historically speaking, that is a terrifying position to hold. Let me use a structural analogy to explain why Pakistan's new role is a double-edged sword. Think about the city of Constantinople during the late Byzantine period. Because it sat perfectly at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, every major power needed it. The Venetians, the Genoese, the Crusaders, the Ottoman Turks, they all relied on it. For a long time, the Byzantines survived by playing these empires against one another. But eventually, Constantinople became so indispensable to so many heavily armed rivals that it could no longer simply exist as a neutral broker. Everyone wanted to control the crossroads, and in 1453, the Ottomans simply took it, and the empire fell. Now, I am not predicting the destruction of Pakistan. The analogy highlights a different truth. When you become the indispensable crossroads, when everyone needs you, that is not a position of supreme strength. It is a position of total, dangerous exposure. Everyone wants to pressure you. Everyone wants to use you. And the moment you fail to deliver what the empires demand, they strip away your protection. Pakistan is the new Constantinople of the 2026 war. Let's break this down using the 4 dimensions of war: economic, political, military, and narrative. First, the economic dimension. This is where Pakistan is bleeding the fastest. Pakistan imports nearly 80% of its oil, mostly from the Gulf. That oil must pass near the Strait of Hormuz, the exact strait Iran closed. Since this war began, transportation costs in Pakistani cities have doubled. Industrial energy bills have surged. Inflation, which was already cripplingly high, is skyrocketing. But worse is the remittances trap. Millions of Pakistanis work in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. The money they send back is the lifeblood of Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves. If this war escalates and Gulf economies contract, those workers lose their jobs, families starve, and Pakistan's fragile economy shatters. Pakistan desperately needs this war to end today. But the harder they push Iran to concede, the more blowback they invite. Second, the political dimension. Pakistan is sitting on a domestic powder keg. You have Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif's government trying to manage the state, while former Prime Minister Imran Khan sits in prison, retaining massive public support. And regardless of party lines, the vast majority of the Pakistani public holds deep sympathy for Iran and the Palestinian cause. So, when Pakistan's military leadership sits in a room with J.D. Vance to broker a deal that pressures Iran, they are walking on a political landmine. The public despises the idea of Islamabad doing Washington's dirty work against a Muslim neighbor. Yet, Pakistan cannot afford to alienate America. Washington holds the keys to the IMF, which Pakistan absolutely needs to avoid sovereign default. They are politically paralyzed, forced to choose between domestic uprising and international bankruptcy. Third, the military dimension. This is where the true gravity of the situation sets in. Pakistan possesses an estimated 160 to 170 nuclear warheads. Unlike the US or Russia, Pakistan operates on a first-use nuclear doctrine. They explicitly reserve the right to deploy nuclear weapons first if they face an existential threat. They share a 500-mile border with Iran. If American airstrikes spill into Pakistani airspace, or if Iranian militants cross the border, a nuclear-armed military is instantly dragged into an active combat zone. Paradoxically, this nuclear status is exactly why Iran trusts them. Tehran knows Islamabad understands the sheer terror of facing down larger nuclear superpowers. But if these peace talks fail, Pakistan is left holding a live grenade. Finally, the narrative dimension. What Pakistan has achieved diplomatically is staggering. Iran's ambassador explicitly stated, "We will do talks in Pakistan and nowhere else because we trust Pakistan." A nation that doesn't recognize Israel and built illicit nukes has become the sole trusted broker for the axis of resistance and the American empire. It is a masterclass in narrative control. But if the talks permanently collapse, the narrative flips overnight. America will demand a scapegoat. The easiest target is always the mediator who failed to deliver. Pakistan could go from being the savior of the world to being branded a terrorist enabler in the blink of an eye. This brings us to game theory, specifically the prisoner's dilemma. In a one-off scenario, the mathematical choice in the prisoner's dilemma is to betray the other party to protect yourself. But in a repeated game where you have to live with the other player tomorrow, the rational strategy is to cooperate. Pakistan is playing a repeated game. They share a border with Iran forever. They need the US economy forever. Their only rational move is genuine, exhausting neutrality. The problem? America is playing a one-shot game. Washington's only goal is immediate Iranian capitulation. Donald Trump does not play for long-term regional stability. He plays for the immediate televised win. Pakistan's sophisticated long-term survival strategy is fundamentally incompatible with America's short-term maximum pressure campaign. So, what happens next? History points to something called the Mercenary Trap. An empire needs a dirty job done, talking to an enemy they publicly despise. They hire a mercenary, in this case Pakistan. The mercenary gets a temporary boost in prestige and cash, but they absorb 100% of the empire's risk. If the job succeeds, the empire takes the credit. If the job fails, the empire abandons the mercenary to the wolves. As long as these peace talks continue, Pakistan is protected. Both sides need the room in Islamabad. But if the ceasefire shatters, if Washington decides to flatten Iranian infrastructure and the talks die, Pakistan is instantly stripped of its diplomatic armor. It goes back to being a broke, politically fractured country, sitting right on the border of World War III, armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. As the dust of this conflict eventually settles, we are going to see a post-American Middle East. A new security architecture will have to be built to balance Israel and Iran. There is a future where Pakistan emerges as the absolute winner of this geopolitical reshuffle. A reality where they become the permanent Switzerland of the Middle East, the indispensable, nuclear-armed, neutral ground connecting China, the US, Iran, and the Gulf. But there is an equally structural reality where Pakistan is crushed under the pressure, where the talks collapse, remittances dry up, the public revolts, and the state fractures. A nuclear-armed nation of 240 million people descending into chaos right next to the Strait of Hormuz is the single most terrifying scenario on the board. When I say this is the most dangerous country in this war, this is exactly what I mean. The fate of the 21st century is currently sitting in a negotiation room in Islamabad. Test this framework against the news you see tomorrow. Watch who their military meets with. Watch their borders. Because the story the media is ignoring is the only story that actually matters.